You're listening to BQN. Assimilate the audio.
Good morning, I'm Chrissie De Clerck-Szilagyi.
And I'm Jason Szilagyi with today's Caffeinated History with the Szilagyis on the BQN Podcast Collective.
Before we jump into our topic for the day, we'd like to take a moment to thank our BQN Patreon patrons who make our show possible. Listeners, you can hear your name listed here as one of our associate producers with a monthly subscription of just $10 at patreon.com/BQN. And with a monthly Patreon subscription of $5 or more, you can join our Meetings of the Hive Mind on the second Saturday of each month. Watch your Patreon messages for details. Today's topic is the second of the Reconstruction Amendments, the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution is a work of compromise. Unlike the 13th, which had a very straightforward purpose, the 14th was crafted to specifically handle issues stemming from the Civil War and its conclusion. Slavery had been outlawed, but how did the former slaves fit into American society? Were they citizens? And if so, how was that status established? And would they be allowed to vote? There was also the question of former Confederates. Had they forfeited their rights by taking up arms against their government? These issues and others were addressed by the Joint Committee on Reconstruction, a group of 15 appointed from the House and the Senate at the beginning of the 1866 congressional session. The first issue tackled by the committee was overturning the 3/5 Clause, an element of the original Constitution that had determined representation of any state by counting all free people and 3/5 of enslaved people. With the abolition of slavery, representation in the House would now be determined by a census of all people in a state. This had the potential to give the former Confederates an undue influence, as counting everyone would see a massive increase in population to be represented if the African American men were not granted the vote. However, adding black suffrage to the amendment seemed a sure way to prevent its being ratified. Most of the northern states even did not yet have black suffrage. A compromise was found in creating a system whereby a state would be penalized by losing representation in the House if they had limited voters based on race or color. The obvious issue, that reasons other than race or color could be found to deny people the right to vote, was debated at the time and proved correct in the decades to come. Despite this, the amendment, only dealing with representation in the vote, was presented to the House and passed. It did not in the Senate. Charles Sumner, Republican of Massachusetts, led the opposition, calling it insufficient at best. Anything less than full equality of citizenship was an unacceptable compromise. In the meantime, the Civil Rights Act of 1866 was being debated in Congress. It made specific the rights of citizens and, essentially, designated all free persons in the United States as citizens, excepting members of the sovereign Indian nations within the country, most of whom did not want to give up their tribal sovereignty, and foreigners who were simply residing in the U.S. This functionally establishes that anyone born on American soil is an American citizen, irrelevant of racial background. Having established this, there could be no legal discrimination conducted by any government, federal, state, or local, against any citizen of the United States, who were all held to be equal before the law. On paper, this meant full civil equality, with the integration of schools, juries, the military, and all public services, full social equality, including the legalization of interracial marriages, and full political equality, from the vote to running for and holding office. The reality did not hold up to the writing. A law could be written without racially discriminative language, but be applied unequally and with racial categories in mind. The Act attempted to prevent this by making the federal government responsible for its enforcement, taking that out of the hands of state and local officials, who were deemed more likely to discriminate. It passed both the House and the Senate, but was vetoed by President Andrew Johnson, then passed again over his veto. All of this convinced those working toward full equality that it needed to be part of the Constitution, not simply a law that could be subject to repeal when political power changed hands. The citizenship issue was made the first part of the 14th Amendment, pushing the issue of representation to Section 2. Section 1 reads thusly: All persons born or naturalized in the United States, and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive a person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. The Privileges and Immunities Clause was extensively debated. It purposefully used language found elsewhere in the Constitution and the founding documents, but this also made it vague. Using precedent created by an 1823 Circuit Court decision, one of its authors, Senator Jacob Howard, Republican of Michigan, argued that these are the rights guaranteed by the Bill of Rights. This was a change away from the original intention of the Bill of Rights, which was to limit federal power, toward a more modern understanding, which sees these as immutable guarantees. It outlawed government activity at any level that could restrict any person's rights as enumerated in the Constitution. This fits well with the Equal Protection Clause that follows, as it outlawed actions by private citizens or organizations that restricted equality of citizenship, for example, the use of violence to intimidate voters. The question of representation in the vote is handled in Section 2, much as it had been worked out previously. It reads as follows. Representatives shall be apportioned among the several states according to their respective numbers, counting the whole number of persons in each state, excluding Indians not taxed. But when the right to vote at any election for the choice of electors for President and Vice President of the United States, representatives in Congress, the executive and judicial officers of a state, or members of the legislature thereof, is denied to any of the male inhabitants of such state, being 21 years of age and citizens of the United States, or in any way abridged, except for participation in rebellion or other crime, the basis of representation therein shall be reduced in the proportion which the number of such male citizens shall bear to the whole number of male citizens 21 years of age in such state. By basing the reduction of congressional representation on a state denying males over the age of 21 their right to vote, the issue of how to include blacks without allowing loopholes for racially based disenfranchisement was seemingly solved. Seemingly, because it still allowed the states a great deal of power in deciding who had the right to vote, and, more importantly, the clause was never enforced, even in the face of the blatant violations of the Jim Crow years. While the amendment did not specifically give black men the vote, it did specify that there would be consequences only for preventing men from voting, not women. The specific use of the word male was a long-fought compromise that immediately saw pushback, particularly from women who had been involved in abolitionist groups and who had hoped and expected that they would get the vote alongside black men, if not before. Women's suffrage would not be settled for another 6 decades, with the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. Section 3 dealt with the involvement of recent Confederates in post-war governance. It reads, no person shall be a senator or representative in Congress, or elector of president and vice president, or hold any office, civil or military, under the United States or under any state, who, having previously taken an oath as a member of Congress or as an officer of the United States, or as a member of any state legislature, or as an executive or judicial officer of any state, to support the Constitution of the United States, shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same, or given aid and comfort to the enemies thereof. But Congress may, by a vote of 2/3 of each house, remove such disability. It was obvious that those who had risen up in arms against their government could not be allowed to have political power. Many senators and congressmen thought this was too lenient as a punishment for treason, but it served an additional purpose, to ensure that the former Confederate states would self-police in their choices of leadership. If those involved in the rebellion could not be in power, those who had not been involved in the rebellion would be, and they were far more likely to create and maintain a government that put into effect the equality now required by the Constitution. It was believed to be very much of the moment, and until recently had been essentially forgotten. In the years between 1865 and 2021, no one who had, quote, engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the United States had subsequently tried to hold a major public office. It is worth noting that even though the authors of the 14th did not think this would be relevant in the future, it did not specify, quote, the recent rebellion or, quote, members of the Confederacy. It was left open to assure that if it were needed, it could be invoked and enforced. Section 4 was also of the moment, the question of whether the debt incurred by the federal government in conducting the war would be paid back. It reads, the validity of the public debt of the United States, authorized by law, including debts incurred for payment of pensions and bounties for service in suppressing insurrection or rebellion, shall not be questioned. But neither the United States nor any state shall assume or pay any debt or obligation incurred in aid of insurrection or rebellion against the United States, or any claim for the loss or emancipation of any slave, but all such debts, obligations, and claims shall be held illegal and void. So, those who had provided money to help put down the rebellion would have their loans paid back. Those who had provided money to the Confederacy were out of luck. It also makes clear that slaveholders would not be compensated for the loss of their human property. This was, like the previous section, mostly forgotten until the debt ceiling discussion of 2011, when it was evoked in opposition to those who would see the U.S. government default on its debts. At the time, a compromise was reached, and so the question of whether not paying the federal debt would violate the Constitution has not yet been answered. The last section of the amendment is the same as the 13th. Quote, "The Congress shall have the power to enforce, by appropriate legislation, the provisions of this article." It was still a radical idea that the federal government could and would exercise this level of power, but it was not nearly as radical as the sections above it. The ratification of the 14th Amendment overlapped with the midterm elections of 1866, which ended with the Republicans having more power in the Senate and Congress and their takeover of Reconstruction, in part as a reaction to the debates around the amendment. President Johnson had campaigned for Southern Democrats with the idea of preventing the amendment from ever being ratified. As congressional Reconstruction took over, the former Confederate states who had been brought back into the Union under Johnson were now pushed back and put under military rule. They were told they could not rejoin until they had written new constitutions and set up new governments which enshrined these ideals of equality. By the summer of 1868, enough of the Southern states had been readmitted and ratified the 14th Amendment for it to be added to the Constitution. One last issue remained, to be dealt with in the 15th Amendment, ensuring the vote for black men. Thank you for listening. We'd also like to thank our History with the Szilagyi Patreon patrons, Pati, Susan Capuzzi-De Clerck, Laura Dull, Kris Hill, Betty Larsen, and Vince Locke. Their contributions help us to have the time to research and write what you're hearing. You can help us just like they do with a monthly subscription at patreon.com/historywiththeszilagis. Also, thank you to Mark White for the awesome show art and Zach Tripp for the wonderful closing music. Please subscribe in your favorite podcast player, and don't forget to rate and review us there as well. And while you're at it, check out the rest of the great shows on the BQN Collective. We'd love to hear what you think. If you'd like to reach out, you can find our network on Twitter and Blue Sky at BQN Podcasts, and this podcast in the same places at History Szilagyi. You can also talk about any and all of the BQN podcasts in our Facebook group, the BQN Collective. And last but not least, you can find me on Twitter and Blue Sky at The Goddess Livia. That's TheGoddessLivia.
And me at Jason Dark Elf. We'd love to hear topic suggestions. What would you like to learn on Caffeinated History?